The GPS navigation system in her Honda Accord had been her compass for 20 years, but in her dreams, Dr. Patricia Pat Rodriguez still calculated orbital trajectories and spacecraft velocities that could carry humans to Mars. Pat, 69, sat in the seventh row of the Tonight Show studio, her engineer's mind automatically analyzing the studio's structural load-bearing systems while her weathered hands traced invisible mathematical equations on her lap. The small five-star Uber driver 20,000 rides pin on her navy blazer caught the studio lights as she adjusted her position. To the thousands of passengers who had ridden in her car over 2 decades, Pat was just another reliable driver who somehow always knew the most efficient routes and could explain complex topics during rides in ways that made difficult concepts sound simple. What they didn't know is that they were being driven by a woman who had once calculated the flight paths that sent astronauts to space. What Pat didn't know was that her story had been quietly circulating among aerospace engineering forums and NASA alumni groups after a passenger had posted about the Uber driver who solved my fluid dynamics homework problem in 15 minutes and explained rocket propulsion better than my college professor. Someone had begun investigating the background of Patricia Rodriguez and discovered patents filed in her name for spacecraft navigation systems that were still being used by NASA today. Pat's story had begun with dreams as boundless as the universe itself. Born in Mexico to parents who worked in agriculture, she had shown exceptional mathematical ability from childhood, solving complex problems in her head while other children struggled with basic arithmetic. When her family immigrated to the United States when she was 12, Pat's talent had earned her a full scholarship to MIT, where she'd studied aerospace engineering with dreams of designing the spacecraft that would explore the solar system. The training had been rigorous and inspiring. Pat had learned orbital mechanics, propulsion systems, materials science, and the computational methods needed to solve the three-dimensional chess game of space navigation. Her master's thesis on optimized trajectory calculations for Mars mission planning had been so impressive that NASA had recruited her directly from MIT to join their jet propulsion laboratory in Pasadena. Also, for 15 years, Dr. Patricia Rodriguez had been part of the team that made space exploration possible. She'd worked on the Mars Pathfinder mission, contributed to the Cassini-Huygens Saturn probe, and helped design navigation systems for dozens of unmanned spacecraft. Her colleagues had respected her ability to solve complex orbital mechanics problems that stumped other engineers, and she'd been on track for promotion to senior mission designer when everything changed. The budget cuts of 2004 had devastated NASA's programs, eliminating hundreds of positions and canceling missions that had been years in development. Pat, despite her expertise and contributions, had been laid off along with dozens of other engineers when Congress reduced NASA's funding for unmanned exploration. At 54, she'd found herself unemployed in a field where government contracts dominated employment opportunities. The rideshare driving had started as temporary work while Pat searched for another aerospace position, but 20 years later, she'd discovered that the engineering job market had moved on without her. Younger engineers with more recent experience had filled the available positions, and her NASA credentials, while impressive, couldn't overcome the perception that her skills were outdated in an industry that changed rapidly. But Pat had never stopped being an engineer. She'd used her mathematical skills to optimize her driving routes, applying the same systematic thinking that had once guided spacecraft to maximize efficiency and passenger satisfaction. During rides, she'd help college students with physics problems, explained scientific concepts to curious passengers, and even consulted informally on engineering projects for riders who discovered her background. The Tonight Show tickets had been a surprise gift from her daughter, Maria, who worked as a nurse and had always been proud of her mother's NASA career. "Mom, you've spent 20 years driving other people to their dreams," Maria had said. "Let someone celebrate yours for once." It was a Tuesday night taping in September, and Jimmy was in good spirits after interviewing an astronaut about his recent mission to the International Space Station. During his commercial break, interaction with the audience, his attention was drawn to Pat by the way she was quietly studying the studio's lighting configuration with obvious technical knowledge. "Ma'am, you look like someone who pays attention to how things work. What do you do for a living?" Pat straightened with the precise posture of someone accustomed to technical presentations. "I drive for Uber, sir. Been doing rideshare for 20 years here in the city." A warm murmur went through the nearby audience members. 20 years of safely transporting passengers through New York traffic was noteworthy dedication. 20 years of Uber driving? That's incredible service. You must know every street in New York by now. Pat's face lit up with the systematic thinking that had never left her. Oh, yes, it's all about optimization, really. Traffic patterns, route efficiency, time of day, variables. You learn to treat the city like a complex system with predictable patterns and variables you can account for. You make it sound very scientific, like there's real strategy involved. Well, there is science to it. Physics, actually, understanding acceleration, braking distances, energy efficiency, plus mathematical optimization for route planning. It's more complex than people realize. Jimmy noticed something in Pat's language, a technical sophistication that went far beyond typical rideshare experience. The way she casually mentioned mathematical optimization suggested serious technical background. Pat, you seem to really understand physics and mathematics on a deeper level. Have you always been a driver? Pat paused, as if deciding how much of her past to reveal. Actually, I studied engineering in college, aerospace engineering. I had a different kind of career before driving. The mention of aerospace engineering caught the audience's attention immediately. Aerospace engineers typically worked for major corporations or government agencies, not as Uber drivers. Aerospace engineering, where did you study? MIT, and I worked for NASA for 15 years before budget cuts ended that career. Jimmy's curiosity exploded. NASA engineers were among the elite technical professionals in the world, and someone with that background driving for Uber suggested a dramatic story. Jimmy made a decision that would change everything. Pat, you worked for NASA? That's incredible. Would you mind coming down here and telling us about that career? Pat looked uncertain. Oh, I don't think people want to hear about old space projects. That was a long time ago. Trust me, people definitely want to hear about NASA work. Come on down. As Pat made her way to the stage with the measured steps of someone who had once walked through mission control rooms, her bearing transformed completely, the confident presence of someone who had once been responsible for billion-dollar spacecraft and human lives. When she reached the stage, Jimmy guided her to a comfortable chair. Ladies and gentlemen, Jimmy announced, this is Dr. Patricia Rodriguez. For 20 years, she's been safely driving passengers through New York, but before that, she spent 15 years at NASA helping to explore the solar system. Pat, tell us about your work at NASA. Pat settled into the chair, and when she spoke about aerospace engineering, her voice took on the authority of someone who had mastered one of the most complex technical fields in existence. I worked at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, designing navigation systems for unmanned spacecraft. My specialty was orbital mechanics, calculating the trajectories that would get spacecraft from Earth to other planets with maximum efficiency. The audience was completely quiet, processing this revelation. Orbital mechanics was rocket science in the most literal sense. Or what missions did you work on? Pat's eyes lit up with memories of her technical prime. Mars Pathfinder was my first major project. We had to calculate a trajectory that would get the spacecraft to Mars in exactly the right position for landing. Then Cassini-Huygens to Saturn, which required gravitational assists from Venus and Earth to reach the outer solar system. You personally worked on missions that reached Mars and Saturn? Part of the team, yes. Spacecraft navigation is collaborative work, trajectory design, propulsion calculations, mission planning. My job was making sure we could get from point A to point B in the vacuum of space, accounting for planetary motion, gravitational effects, fuel limitations. The studio was mesmerized by Pat's casual description of solving problems that most people couldn't even comprehend. What happened? Why did you leave NASA? Pat's expression grew more somber. Budget cuts in 2004. Congress reduced NASA's funding for unmanned exploration, and hundreds of engineers lost their positions. Despite 15 years of successful missions, experience doesn't matter when there's no money for projects. So you started driving as temporary work? That's right. Just until I could find another aerospace position. But the industry had changed by the time positions opened up again. Younger engineers with more recent experience, different software systems, new approaches. At 54, I was considered outdated despite my expertise. Jimmy leaned forward. But you never stopped being an engineer, did you? Pat smiled for the first time since taking the stage. You can't unlearn how to think systematically, so I applied engineering principles to driving route optimization, traffic flow analysis, energy efficiency calculations. My passengers got the benefit of NASA level problem solving applied to getting across Manhattan. Jimmy reached behind his chair and pulled out a tablet loaded with patent database information. Pat, we did some research before tonight's show. He showed her patent applications filed under her name. According to the U.S. Patent Office, Dr. Patricia Rodriguez holds 12 patents for spacecraft navigation systems, several of which are still being used by NASA today. Pat looked stunned. You found my patent. We did. Patent 6,745,123 autonomous navigation system for deep space missions. This patent was implemented in the New Horizons mission to Pluto. The studio fell silent. The audience was processing that the Uber driver had designed navigation systems for spacecraft that had reached the edge of the solar system. NASA is still using your work? Apparently so. Space missions take decades to plan and execute, so systems designed in the 1990s are still being used in current missions. Jimmy continued reading. Pat, listen to this from your former NASA colleague, Dr. Michael Chen. Patricia Rodriguez was one of the most brilliant trajectory designers I ever worked with. Her navigation algorithms were so elegant and efficient that we're still using her approaches 20 years later. Losing her was one of the worst consequences of the budget cuts. Pat's eyes filled with tears. Mike Chen said that? He did. And Pat, there's something else. The current NASA administrator has been trying to locate you. They want to offer you a consulting position on the new Mars mission planning. Pat sat in stunned silence. They want me to work on Mars missions again? They do. Because, Pat, your expertise didn't become obsolete. The government just couldn't afford it for a while. Now they can, and they need engineers who understand deep space navigation. Jimmy stood and addressed the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, this woman has spent 20 years safely transporting New Yorkers while carrying knowledge that could help humanity reach other planets. She's been applying rocket science to rush hour traffic. He turned back to Pat. The aerospace engineering community wants to honor you. MIT wants to invite you back as a guest lecturer to inspire students who are pursuing careers you helped make possible. Jimmy had one more surprise. Pat, we have someone here who wanted to meet you. From backstage, a figure in a NASA flight suit appeared. Astronaut Jessica Chen recently returned from the International Space Station. Dr. Rodriguez, the astronaut said, approaching Pat with obvious respect, I've been using navigation systems you designed for 15 years. Every time I've gone to space, your algorithms helped get me there safely. Thank you for making my career possible. Pat was openly crying now, overwhelmed by the recognition and the connection between her past work and current space exploration. Used my navigation systems. Every astronaut has, Dr. Rodriguez. Your work is part of the foundation that makes human spaceflight possible. NASA never forgot your contributions, even when budget constraints forced difficult decisions. Jimmy sat back down beside Pat. Pat, you've spent 20 years thinking your aerospace career was over, but what you really did was take a 20-year sabbatical while your innovations continued exploring the solar system. As they helped Pat back to her seat, she stopped and looked out at the audience one more time. Thank you, but I want young people to know setbacks aren't permanent and knowledge never becomes worthless. Keep learning, keep solving problems, and don't let temporary obstacles convince you that your dreams are finished. The episode that aired became one of the most inspiring Tonight Show segments of the year, sparking conversations about age discrimination in technical fields and the value of experienced engineers. Pat's story inspired NASA to create a program actively recruiting experienced engineers who had been displaced by budget cuts, and several aerospace companies established consulting programs specifically for senior technical talent. The Patricia Rodriguez Scholarship was created at MIT, to support older students pursuing aerospace engineering careers. Pat accepted NASA's consulting offer and spent her retirement working on Mars mission planning while continuing to drive part-time, discovering that leaving full-time aerospace work hadn't ended her contribution to space exploration. It had just delayed her return to helping humanity reach for the stars. At 71, Pat still calculates optimal routes with an engineer's precision, still believes that every problem has an elegant solution, and still carries her NASA badge alongside her Uber driver credentials. A reminder that sometimes the most important journeys happen not in spacecraft, but in the hearts and minds of people who refuse to give up on their dreams of exploration. Because sometimes the most qualified people for reaching other planets are the ones who've learned to navigate the complexities of Earth with grace, patience, and the unshakable belief that with enough careful calculation and persistent effort, any destination is achievable. Rhetoric Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.